Asyle, Tropical Island Survival. Week 4, Day 1. I think it's supposed to take a couple of weeks before you know if your plants are dead, but I think by this time I can at least tell which ones are in a bad way or not. The taros seem to be doing quite well regardless of the soil I put them in, but prefer the running water to stagnant, which won't be a problem to provide. As for the sweet potatoes and yams, my aeroponic trough gardening scheme seems to be working. Although I've seen other people use similar setups, I wasn't convinced it would work with this equipment until now. Armed with this information, I think I can start planting my garden now, and the sooner the better. After collecting the fish in the morning, I cut down and split some more bamboo for my yam troughs, and drilled the drainage holes before mounting them on the retaining walls of the terraces. The slope of the retaining wall should let the water trickle down from one trough to the next, and give each plant's roots a place to grab water as it passes. The drilling alone probably took me the better part of a couple of hours. I also held on to all the bamboo leaves to make curtains to keep the roots dark. Finally, I used my digging stick to reroute the rivulet into the terraces and down their walls in a cascade, using a little clay mud to make sure that the water flowed into the yam troughs. It's a very slow trickle, but that's what I wanted anyway, and it's going to take forever for the terraces to fill up. I also made sure to dig a couple of channels between the terraces so water could pass between them, in the event that one of them gets clogged up or loses water for some reason. In the meantime, I'll head over to the east side of the island and start digging up the area where I found all the yams and sweet potatoes before. I noted to myself when I first came across the yams and sweet potatoes on the east side of the island that I found it a bit strange that they seemed to dominate the area, and I think I found a clue as to why. While I was digging up the tubers and vines for transplanting, I noticed at one point a pot shard mixed in with the dirt. I double-checked and it's definitely pottery, and definitely not one of mine. That means people lived here, or tried to live here, a long time ago. Almost certainly ancient Polynesians. The fact that the yams and sweet potatoes dominate here is probably because they tried to start a farm in this area, and my suspicions were confirmed when I looked around a little more and found a partially buried stone retaining wall, not unlike my own. I'll hold on to the potsherd and make a note to conduct an archaeological survey of this area later. In any case, I returned to base with my plants and installed them in their respective troughs, before covering them with the richer topsoil of the island, rather than the clay substrata. I used both the tubers and the vine cuttings to hedge my bets. The trickling of the stream should be keeping them all lightly watered now. I returned to the mangrove swamp and started digging for taros. I had to collect more of them than the potatoes, because there's more room for them in the terraces. By the time I got back, the terraces had finished filling with water, as intended. I planted the taros partially submerged in the water and surrounded them with dirt, grabbing some sticks to create little retaining walls around them, the same way I think I remember seeing them cultivated on TV. I wish I'd thought of that before I flooded the terraces. Planting took most of the remainder of the day, and it's starting to get dark now that I've finished, so I can't admire my work until tomorrow. Still, I'm pleased. Even though I don't expect to get any results for at least 6 months, it's a major first step towards self-sufficiency. As an aside, while I was out digging for taros, I found another plant in the swamp that was unmistakably a water lily. I'm not sure if they're good for anything, but I decided to throw a few into the terraces as well, figuring they were part of the natural ecosystem the taros already live in, and that it would be important to try and maintain that. Plus, they look pretty. I'll spend at least an hour of my evening before bed describing them in my notebook. Water lily. Aquatic plant with brown leaves growing on long stems from a submerged root, with white, pink, or purple blossoms with many spiky petals and a yellow center. No obvious uses. Week 4, Day 2. I'm starting to get a surplus of fish and fruit, and when the gardens start kicking in, I anticipate having a surplus of potatoes. It's a good problem to have, but I'm going to need someplace cool and dry to store all of it to make it last as long as possible. To that end, I've decided to build a second hut next to the garden, primarily for food preparation and storage, which will probably take the better part of the next week and a half. I'll outline another circular foundation for the new structure, roughly 10 feet in diameter, and start digging the cellar first. The cellar is going to be about 6 or 7 feet deep, so I can stand up straight in it, which means I'll need to clear out up to 550 cubic feet of dirt, and at my normal digging rate, that should take me about 9 or 10 hours. Fortunately, I can use my basket hat to help me bail out the dirt as I dig, and I can use the ladder I built before to get in and out as the hole gets deeper. I worked through the day and got the cellar done before collapsing. I'm going to go to bed early now, but at least now the hard part should be over. Week 4, Day 3. After doing my morning chores, I collected some bamboo and built a strong lattice to function as the roof of the cellar and the floor of the kitchen hut, leaving a hole in the center through which to climb in and out. I then mixed the clay I dug out when excavating the cellar with water from the rivulet, and filled in the gaps in the lattice. I also used it to make the ceiling of the cellar as domed as possible to help support the roof over it, giving the oculus extra reinforcement as it will be under ring compressive forces. Now that the cellar is actually complete, I'll use some of the bamboo cord to hang my fish from the ceiling, and strew all the salt I've collected on the floor, turning the room into a massive dehydrator. Whenever the salt gets soggy, I can just cook it or lay it out to dry in the sun. If necessary, I can even make a fire down there to heat or smoke the food I collect, but otherwise it should stay pretty cool down there. It crossed my mind that I could make a deep moat and surround the cellar with water from the river to keep it as close to refrigerated as I can get under these conditions, but I would be more worried about hydrostatic pressure eventually collapsing the walls. Either way, that's a project for the future, not the present. I'll light a fire down there anyway to help the walls and ceiling set. With the cellar built, I started working on the rest of the kitchen hut. Like the beach hut, I wove a cage frame for the walls and roof with bamboo, but this time I omitted the log posts. This is because I'm going to use all the clay I dug up to fill in the gaps to make solid clay walls, as the clay will provide some compressive strength to the structure, and frankly the posts for the beach hut were kind of overkill to begin with. I made circular windows in the frame, and an arched doorway to distribute stresses evenly and minimize the risks of cracking or damage. And like the cellar, I made an oculus at the apex of the domed roof. I also left some rods sticking out of the wall frame for constructing countertops and shelves later, as well as 2 smaller doors opposite the entrance stacked on top of each other, where I'll put a new, larger kiln. As I daubed on the mud today, I made the walls wider at the bottom than the top for structural strength, and had to use my ladder again to fill in the top of the domed ceiling. It kind of hurts my shoulders to do that for very long, and it reminds me of when I had to hang drywall for the ceiling of the new church building. The hut is a hollow cylinder 10 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and about half a foot thick, and the roof is a dome of the same dimensions, giving it a volume of about 105 cubic feet, which explains why I was able to finish it in a couple of hours, and didn't even exhaust 1/5 of the dirt I dug up yesterday. Oh well, plenty for other projects later. While I was filling in the roof, I used a piece of bamboo to form a gutter around the top, to direct water off and in one direction, so when it rains, I can collect it in a pot. Every little bit helps. It won't be pure, but I can fix that. After my lunch break, I started working on adding the new kiln onto the structure. Although it would take less energy and time to just move the kiln I have, I decided to make a bigger one so I can fire larger pots. I used the same basic construction process that I used for the hut, building a bamboo frame adjacent to the kitchen where the small door was. This is where I'll put the wood into the kiln. This way I can keep the inside of the hut cooler, as most of the hot kiln will be outside. The design is basically a much larger version of the one at the beach hut, scaled up to accommodate my best guess for the largest full water pot I could conceivably carry, both chambers about 3 feet tall each and at least 2 feet in diameter. With that in mind, as I built the framework for the kiln, I made a solid platform to support the cooking surface between the fire and cooking chambers, with a domed ceiling for each to make sure that the whole structure is well supported. Then I started adding clay. I made sure to leave several air vents in the bottom of the fire chamber and a funnel at the top to direct gases up and under the cooking surface. On the cooking surface, I once again used a piece of bamboo as a guide to make a clay tube spiraling out from the center and up the walls before venting out the back of the kiln's roof. Coiling the smoke vents was a challenge because the doors were in the way of making a continuous coil around the perimeter of the cooking chamber, like in my first kiln. The only solution I could think of was to make the venting tubes make a sharp 180-degree turn at the doors, zigzagging from one side of the chamber to the other and back again. This concerns me, however, as creosote might build up in those sharp corners and start a chimney fire, which could eventually become so hot that it would crack the tubes. However, if I periodically run the kiln extra hot, like for when I'm cooking pots, that should keep the creosote from building up and encourage more complete combustion of the fuels. This was the most complicated and time-consuming part of the construction process, so it wasn't until evening that I finished. I'm going to go to bed early again. Week 4, Day 4. I was so busy with the kitchen yesterday that I ran out of wood, so I collected some in the morning after getting the fish. It's just as well because I'm starting to run low on paper again, and I'm going to need some more bamboo to finish the kitchen building. Once again, having to stop every so often to collect firewood is getting old, and I'd really like some way to avoid it. For the moment, however, I have a kitchen hut to finish. It's basically a giant pot, so it's going to need at least a full day in the sun before it's dry, probably weeks. Still, I've lit a small fire in the new kiln to help it along, as it's the only part I actually need to be solid. Not a hot enough fire to make it crack, though. The first thing I'll want to do with it is make some larger storage pots because I don't really have anywhere to store my dried fish anymore. I started building the new pots, but realized that because they're so much bigger, it's going to take forever to build any great number of them. So instead, I decided to get ready for a little mass production by building a mold. I used the clay I had lying around to make a sort of conical form on the ground. I bent a piece of bamboo into an arc and put a small peg at the apex on the inside of the curve, using lengths of cord to hold it in tension, like 3 bows on a single branch. The idea was that these cords would effectively turn it into a rotating clay cutting tool, and I used it to make sure the mold was perfectly symmetric, as any irregularities may disrupt the structural integrity of the pots. By adjusting the positions of the strings, I hoped to make the pots roughly cylindrical on the outside, but taper on the inside, as their large size may cause them to deform while drying. After that, I sprinkled some clay dust on the mold like flour on a cake pan, before slapping wet clay onto it, which I cut uniformly with the tool, adjusting the positions of the strings so that the pots produced would have an even thickness. I then carefully pulled the wet clay off the mold and left it out to dry. Unfortunately, this whole scheme only worked in part, as attempting to remove the pots from the mold ended up destroying them because they were still so soft and fragile. However, it did help me make loops of clay to a more precise diameter before stacking them together and smoothing them down. This helped speed things up a little, but I think that if I want to make a lot of pots in the future, I'm going to need a real potting wheel. However, I couldn't think of a quick and dirty way that I could build one today, so I just built a couple of large coil pots and started drying them using the tools I built to make them relatively precise and radially symmetric, one a little bigger than the other, so I can try using them as solid molds for making large pots in the future. With that plan busted, I decided to get on with constructing the other features for the kitchen. I made some simple doors and shutters this time. By leaving the window frames partially exposed, I was able to tie a bit of cord to it and weave a little basket lid for the shutters. I did the same thing for the door, and because the door is so light, it won't put much of a load on the door frame or hinges. I also wove a little conical hat for the oculus to keep the rain and sun out, but still allow heat to vent out of the roof. I remembered to make a brazier to hang from the ceiling for light at night, which did not need to be as complicated as the one for my beach hut. It was getting late in the day when I started on it though, so it probably won't be dry until later tomorrow. I then spent some time working on the counters and shelves. I wove a little bamboo on the rods that I left in the walls and surrounded them with clay to make them flat and solid, adding arches of clay underneath at intervals for structural support, and protruding hooks to hang things on later. The counters and shelves wrap all the way around the interior of the kitchen because I have no reason for them not to. The shelves sit just above the windows, and the counters are level with the cooking chamber and the kiln. I also wove a couple of doors for the kiln, and surrounded them with clay to protect them and help them retain the heat of the kiln. However, I left a small hole in each, so I can look inside without opening them, and get an idea of whether things are cooked, or if the fire needs stoking. Speaking of the kiln, by this point the clay was dry enough that I could add a little more to it, so I covered the heating coil on the bottom of the cooking chamber with a layer of clay to protect it and make it flat. I have a little daylight left, so I'll wander around and gather more wood and fruit before heading to bed. Week 4, Day 5. The kiln was dry by this morning, so after my morning chores I lit a real fire in it, and started cooking my pot mold, which will probably take all day. I glazed the interior of the kiln with salt water out of habit first though, which should also make cleaning easier. I even poured it down the inside of the heating coils to reduce the likelihood of creosote buildup. I didn't install the kiln doors yet though, because they probably aren't dry. I put my distilling pot in the cooking chamber to take advantage of the heat. One problem with the bigger kiln is that it'll take more heat and more fuel to get its larger volume up to a particular temperature. However, once it reaches that temperature, it should stay that way for a long time, and once again, the smokestack should help minimize heat loss. I kept almost falling into the cellar yesterday while I was working on the counters, so I stopped today to make a bamboo grate to cover it, packing it with clay so it'll hold cool air in the cellar and still sit flush with the floor. I also added a bamboo cord handle so it's easy to lift up. I found myself in another what now moment while I waited for my pots to cook, so I collected some vanilla grass and wove a mat for the kitchen floor. It should help with cleanup in the future and keep the kitchen smelling nice. While I was thinking about keeping things clean, I made a broom by bundling a bunch of thin sticks and reeds together and tying them to the end of a bamboo shaft, using a little cord to weave them into a flat plane like a real broom, rather than a witch's broom. I'm still kind of at a loss for what to do with the rest of the day. I guess because I've got a place to process and store food, I should collect some food to process and store. I spent the rest of the morning doing a more thorough collection of food from the forest, along with firewood, because I keep falling behind on that. I really need to make this a more consistent part of my daily routine. I also made sure to collect plenty of banana leaves for drying out the collected food. I collected loads of breadfruit, figs, bananas, coconuts, and eggs. I'll leave the tuberous plants alone for when the fruit are out of season. To preserve them, I first put the eggs straight in the boiling water in the kiln, and then used my pocket knife to cut up the fruit and lay them out to dry in the sun for the rest of the day. I left the coconuts alone, figuring they'll basically keep themselves fresh in the cool, dry environment of the cellar as long as they're not damaged. I can probably do the same thing with the tubers when it's time to harvest them. It's nearing the end of the day, and I swapped out the outer and inner molds for firing overnight. I still have a few hours before it gets dark though, so I'll cut down a whole bunch of bamboo and sugarcane plants, chop them up just below their partitions, and then bury their ends in or near the rivulet, since I've seen these kinds of plants regrown from cuttings in this manner before. Week 4, Day 6. I've been working really hard, so I ended up just relaxing in the evening down by the beach hut, looking at the stars until it was time to go to sleep. In the morning, I got my water boiling, caught my fish as usual, and spent an additional hour in the forest collecting wood, fruit, and eggs from my chicken houses, as the chickens have acclimatized to them by now. The kiln doors were dry by this time, so I installed them before lighting the fire. I tried using my new mold to make clay pots, but I found I can only use it to make one at a time. I made the pots by lining the outer mold with clay to approximately the thickness I wanted, and then carefully smushed in the inner mold, being careful not to push so hard that something broke. This allowed me to get a pot that was mostly uniform in thickness, but I had to leave the clay to dry in the outer mold, since it's too weak to be removed. It's not too big a deal, I suppose, since it should shrink a little while it dries, and be easier to get out once the whole thing is finished firing, which is why I took the inner mold out, as the compression from shrinkage would cause the pots to crack. Besides, I can only fire one big pot at a time anyway. While I was at it, I made some crude clay plates for the kitchen, so I don't have to keep using banana leaves. Then, to make it easier for me to work for long periods of time in the kitchen, I collected some bamboo and built another storage stool, only this one I made round, and put a lattice on the top and bottom, like a barrel, designing it in such a way that under no circumstances can it fall through the hole into the cellar. I've done just about everything I can think of for the kitchen at this point, short of putting in a drive-through. All that's really left, and that I guess I've kind of been avoiding, is getting rid of the virtual mountain of dirt I've dug up around it. I've mostly gotten my strength back, and I've got some plans for how I can make that dirt pile useful. I won't feel like the kitchen is done until it's out of the way. I'll start making a rough outline on the ground for the structure I want to build next, and then use my wheelbarrow to pile the dirt up in the middle, so it'll be easier to access and clean away as I build. At least I'll be carting it all downhill, so it won't be as hard as carting around all those rocks for the terraces was. There should be about 445 cubic feet of clay left, and if I can keep up my usual pace, it should take me about 8 hours to move it all, not counting my lunch break. It's the end of the day. I'm tired. I'm going to have dinner and go to bed early. Week 4, Day 7. It has now been officially 1 month since I was stranded here, and while on the one hand it just drives home the fact that I'm probably going to be stuck here for a long time, on the other it kind of feels like a milestone I should celebrate. After my morning chores, set the pot and plates cooking, and got a new large pot molded and drying. As before, today is for rest, research, and art, as well as just making my life here a little more comfortable. And what would make me more comfortable right now would be softer clothing, a better sleeping surface, and definitely a better means of keeping cool. As far as clothing is concerned, I've considered the different options available to me. I think wearing fibers from most of the plants and grasses I've seen so far would probably feel like wearing a burlap sack, and traditional Polynesian bark cloth is too valuable to me right now as writing paper, plus I wouldn't be able to wear much of it in this heat. That leaves the harakeke fibers, which I haven't really tried weaving into string or rope yet, because the bamboo cords have been working fine so far. I remember they can be used for making all sorts of string, rope, and cloth from the Motunui online game too, assuming it was accurate to real life. But I tried extracting the fibrous veins from the leaves, and I realize now that it would take forever to process into anything useful. I'd need a loom for weaving cloth though, regardless of whatever fibers I decided to use, so I'll need to keep that on the back burner as well. Regarding a better bed, I briefly considered collecting chicken down from the chicken houses as I collect the eggs, but I'm concerned about the possibility of picking up mites or fleas from them, which could transmit diseases to me. Besides, I was never a big fan of down pillows anyway. As for keeping cool, at this point there's really only one thing I can do for that. While the clay of my kitchen hut acts as both a thermal insulator and capacitor to keep things relatively cool, temperatures in the tropics never really drop below 22 centigrade, which is basically death for me. Sheer stubbornness has been the only thing keeping me alive through it up to this point. I've tried hiding down in the cellar on the hotter afternoons, and while it is cooler underground, the salt slowly dries me out along with the fish, which also makes for an unpleasant smell, so it's hard to stay down there for very long. The only other thing I can do to cool off is jump in the ocean, but on top of the hazardous echinoderms and gastropods I mentioned, the salt water dries me out too. What I need is at least a freshwater shower, if not a whole pool. I may want to make something a little more sophisticated later, but for now, I can fill a large pot with water and set it up high, and build a spigot into the side of the pot to let the water spray out onto me. I added a hole to the bottom of the large pot I was in the middle of drying in the sun, and put some clay reinforcement around it so I could add a bamboo spigot later. I then let it get back to drying, cut some bamboo, and assembled it into a scaffold to hold the pot up once it's finished. I'm once again running out of ideas for what to do with my waiting time. I'm not really the type to enjoy just lazing about, and I feel like I have to keep busy to avoid thinking too hard about my situation. Still, I can't beat up my body with work 7 days a week. Since I don't have to use my small kiln for water anymore, I guess I could use the spare distilling hat to start producing some interesting chemicals for use later. The first one I want to try making is ammonia, which is also the easiest to make, namely from urine, which is broken down by bacteria into ammonia, which evaporates. I'll sacrifice a pot to start storing it, but it'll still take a while to collect a useful amount to begin distilling, so I think I'll start playing a little with the latex I've been collecting. I know it produces a terrible smell when cured, which is produced by bacteria breaking down the proteins in the sap, giving it that characteristic new tire smell, which I want to keep out of the finished product as much as possible. The only way I can think of to do that is dilution, so I'll take my already diluted latex and potash solution and add a little bit of grapefruit juice to it until I see the latex start to separate. It would be so much easier if the latex precipitated to the bottom of the container, because then I could just decant the water off the top. However, latex is less dense than water, so it curdles and floats to the top. As such, I'll have to skim the latex off the top as it forms, at which point I'll add it to more water, squeeze it, replace the water, and repeat to get the proteins out. I made another sheet of the stuff and laid it out in the sun for further testing. I don't expect it to be any less sticky, but I still want to improve my technique for shaping and processing the stuff, because I have some plans for it later. I took 4 pots to the various breadfruit and fig trees around the island and started tapping them. I made sure to mark at least one tree as off limits for tapping, just in case I accidentally end up killing the trees by tapping them. I don't want to destroy my primary food supply. I'll add collecting latex and reopening the wounds to keep the sap flowing to my morning chores from now on. While I was out placing the pots, it occurred to me that I can also start making ethanol with my still, though I would never realistically think about drinking it. To me, ethanol is a solvent, an antiseptic, and a fuel, not to be taken internally. It could just be useful for many different chemical experiments, so on the way back from placing the latex pots, I collected as much rotten fruit from the forest floor as I could, and left it in a pot of water to break down. I still have a lot of the day free, so I think I'll have another walk around the island looking for interesting plants to describe. This time I'll focus more on the various trees, which I've been largely overlooking in favor of the smaller plants, herbs, and shrubs so far. Mangrove tree. Tree or shrub with long, arching aerial roots, smooth trunks, and elliptical leaves, with parallel veins organized radially about the ends of the branches. They produce small white or yellow flowers and acorn-shaped seeds with a long sprout hanging out of the bottom of them. These plants do best in shallow, saltwater marshes. No obvious uses besides wood. Hibiscus. Tree or shrub with round, dark green, heart-shaped leaves, and large yellow or pink flowers with a dark spot and long pistil in center. Grows in mangrove swamps. Leaves appear to be non-toxic, useful for wood, bark paper, and rope from the branches. Orange lay tree. Tall branching tree with long oval leaves and bright orange flowers with crinkly petals, reminiscent of those used on lays. Useful for wood. Bitter macadamia. Branching tree with glossy oval leaves, clusters of small white flowers, and white nuts surrounded by green skin. Nuts and leaves were extremely bitter, probably toxic, but nuts were oily when pressed, might be useful as lamp oil, otherwise useful for wood. Island walnut. Branching tree with mint green, 3-lobed leaves, clusters of small white flowers, and green fruit with white nuts inside. Tastes fine but go bad pretty quickly. Also very oily, and may be a useful source of lamp oil. Otherwise useful for wood. Spade leaf tree. Branching tree or shrub with 3-lobed leaves shaped like spades, tiny red flowers that grow in spherical clusters, and small round, green, bumpy fruit. Bark lining is soft and useful for making paper. Fruit and leaves appear edible. Stinking rosemary. A bush or shrub with small, narrow leaves and bright orange berries surrounding a large seed resembling a coffee bean. Test for caffeine content? Plant produces an unpleasant odor. While I was out collecting plant specimens, I saw several species of web-weaving spiders and got an idea. As I mentioned, I've been hanging out in the cellar every now and then to keep cool, and unfortunately the drying fish, along with all my other food scraps, have been attracting flies. Without access to a shower, I've attracted a few myself. I can't afford to let them contaminate my food supply, and even keeping the cellar hermetically sealed hasn't been entirely adequate, as they're persistent little buggers. However, I had the idea to collect the spiders, carefully shepherding them into short, hollow sections of bamboo left over from my construction projects, and bring them back to base with me. I then proceeded to knock up a handful of simple bamboo frames that I could easily mount in the corners under the counters and shelves, where spiders would naturally make webs anyway, and attached each spider's container to them, so they would have a convenient hidey hole to retreat to when frightened by my activities. I also hid small pieces of fruit or fish behind the frames to attract the flies, so the spiders would catch them in their webs, functioning as a sort of all-natural regenerative fly paper. It's another little innovation that I'm quite pleased with, not least of which because I'm quite fond of spiders. They're intelligent, industrious, and creative, a lot like me, but are also small, weak, and vulnerable, and most people don't like them just because they're different. So I also feel kind of sorry for them, like they need someone to look out for them and protect them. So at my house we've become accustomed to calling them leg friends, and I try to gently pick them up and take them outside whenever I can. In the early afternoon, I took a break for lunch and tried making some dyes from the different plants I've discovered so I could color in my botanical drawings. Fortunately for me, most of the dyes I needed were already in the plants I was drawing. All I had to do was crush up their colored tissues and add a little bit of water for inks. Turmeric made an orangish yellow, vanilla grass made green, red pinecone made red, obviously, and just about everything else could be used to make brown. Around that time I also switched out my pots, perhaps a bit prematurely, but I was getting desperate for a nice cold shower and wanted to get the shower pot cooking as soon as possible. In the meantime, I hung the brazier in the kitchen under the oculus once it was cool, and in the evening when I lit it, I noticed that the ceiling functions sort of like a parabola when the light source is at the right position, directing it downward and producing a more even lighting all around. Some of the light is absorbed by the dark color of the clay, and might be brighter if I could somehow make the ceiling and walls white, but that's a project for another day. For now, I'll work on my writing and drawing into the night, and try to relax a bit before bed. Blooper Reel. Still, I'm pleased, however. That seems a little redundant. I also used it to make the ceiling of the cellar as domed as possible, to help support the roof, to help, so, to help, to helps, to help. Jerry, Jodavola. So I'll take my already diluted latex and so I'll take my already dilute. Why did I scratch my nose? As such, I'll have to skim the latex off the top as it forms, at which point I'll add it to more water, squeeze it, replace the water, and repeat to get the proteins out. Something tells me that wouldn't entirely work. But I still want to improve. Itchy. This time I'll focus more on the rumble. The rumbly tumbly of a hungry for honey Pooh Bear. Ah, there you are. It could it could just be useful. It could just be useful for many different. Hmm? It could just be useful for many different chemical experiments. It could just be useful for many. It could just be useful for many different. And attached each spider's and attached and atta- that. Try saying that 5 times fast. Bark lining. Hey there, you made it all the way to the end. Thanks for listening. I'm planning on making a new video/audio chapter every week for the foreseeable future, concurrent with my stay on the island, which I've had to hide inside of Chinese takeout boxes to get DoorDash to deliver them off the island for me. So, if you like this and want to listen to the next one as soon as it comes out of the oven, you can press the bell button under the video and get it delivered straight to your door. Just look inside the fortune cookies. Now, as much as they say you should have a side hustle, I have no intention of monetizing these videos or starting a Patreon or anything. However, it would still help me out if you could press the subscribe button, because it subliminally tells the hungry YouTube algorithm to call me and order a pizza, during which I hope to get the pizza and myself delivered off this island. I hear the algorithm has been on a diet lately, though, so it would help me out more than anything else if you could share this video with someone you think would enjoy it. And since you apparently enjoyed it enough to get this far, there's a like button under the video that's redeemable for one free meal at the old Castaway Cafe. There's also a dislike button next to it that you can press if you want, but it'll let flies into my kitchen instead. Of course, that's what the spiders are for, so ha! I'm one step ahead of you. Also, if you'd like to chat about your own stories and perspectives on the episode, maybe swap a few favorite recipes or talk about the times you went cooking out in the wilderness, feel free to write them in the comments section below. I welcome suggestions and corrections, and although I can handle a light roasting, just remember that nobody wants to see their hard work get burned. That said, thanks again for listening, and hope to see you here again next week.